The chapel did not announce itself as wrong. From a road, it looked like any other private foundation raised by a northern Italian house eager to separate devotion from the eyes of the town. Pale stone, modest bell, a roof pitched low against winter. It stood just beyond the line of diocesan authority, close enough to be visited, far enough to be excused. The House of Marcelli had built it that way in the opening years of the 13th century, when wealth learned to speak softly and obedience could be demonstrated without surrendering control. The deviation was recorded only because a bishop followed procedure. His visitation was routine, almost bored in its execution. He noted the condition of the walls, the cleanliness of the nave, the presence of candles and vessels. It was only when he stood before the altar that his pen hesitated. The stone table did not face east. It did not face west. It did not align with any recognized axis of liturgical orientation. Its angle was precise, deliberate, and irreconcilable with custom. When questioned, the Marcelli steward replied with practiced vagueness, attributing the placement to inherited plans and local constraints. The bishop marked the note and moved on. What transformed the note into a problem was repetition. Mass records from the chapel, preserved in a thin hand and careful ink, showed observances conducted on days that should have been silent, forbidden feast days. Intervals of abstention filled instead with service. The prayers themselves were altered in a way that defied correction. Phrases were removed without replacement, leaving gaps that were spoken through rather than around. The words did not change meaning. They lost direction. Parish clergy noticed and chose restraint. The Marcelli were donors. The alterations were subtle. Correction could wait. The villagers noticed first what the clergy ignored. They spoke of chanting heard through chapel walls that did not resolve, a call without response, a structure that implied answer yet never received it. The sound carried only a short distance before dissolving, leaving behind a pressure in the ears rather than an echo. Those who lingered reported the cold, not the cold of stone or season, but of contact. Candles burned low and steady, their wax hardening too quickly, their flames bending without draft. The family responded with composure. They attended public services when required. They offered no explanation and asked for none. Within the chapel, the altar remained untouched, its surface refusing warmth even during prolonged use. Metal vessels left upon it chilled faster than surrounding air allowed. This detail appears repeatedly in marginal notes, always struck through, always rewritten elsewhere. The cold was acknowledged but never addressed. Rome was notified obliquely. A letter requesting clarification of architectural variants was drafted, copied, and sent. No reply returned. Instead, the margin of the original was marked with a terse instruction, non-corrigendum, not to be corrected. The phrase carried weight beyond its size. It was repeated in subsequent correspondence, applied to ritual dates, to prayer structures, to the orientation itself. What could not be corrected was allowed to persist. Escalation took the form of silence enforced by administration. A second visitation was ordered without public record. This time the inspector arrived at night, accompanied only by a scribe whose name does not survive intact. They entered the chapel during an unauthorized observance. The scribe's account is fragmentary, preserved because it was misfiled under architectural surveys rather than doctrinal inquiry. He described standing within the nave and realizing that the space did not behave as expected. Sound dampened toward the altar. Footsteps shortened. Breath felt counted. He notes the absence of iconography, not as removal, but as avoidance. The walls were bare where saints should have been painted, yet bore no scars of defacement. The altar stone was clean, unmarked by relic or seal. The family stood without gesture, facing not the altar but the angle it suggested, a direction that led beyond the wall. The scribe records that he could not determine where their attention rested, only that it did not rest on him. Afterward, the report was stamped twice, once with the seal of visitation, once with a smaller mark indicating suppression. It was filed under architecture, indexed away from doctrine. The inspector returned alone. The scribe did not. His name appears later in the payment ledger, crossed out and replaced with an annotation indicating completion of service. The chapel continued. Its bell rang irregularly, often without cause. On certain mornings, Frost formed inside, while dew gathered outside. The altar remained cold. Parishioners adjusted by absence. They avoided the road at certain hours. They learned not to listen for resolution. The Marcelli line persisted, thinning and branching, yet the chapel remained unchanged. The haunting residue of the case is not a ruin but a sensation preserved in record, an altar that refuses heat, a sound that implies response and denies it, a correction that cannot be made and therefore must be archived. In Rome, the suppressed report was eventually retrieved and read alongside another from a different region, noting a similar deviation. The handwriting differed. The margin instruction did not. The second inquiry, ordered quietly and without ceremony, pointed north, toward lands where confession itself had begun to fail. The south of France learned to measure time by interruption. By the middle of the 14th century, plague had broken the calendar into fragments, turning feast days into risks and confession into an act of triage. Villages emptied and refilled unevenly. Priests learned to listen quickly. Penitents learned to speak with precision. It was in this environment of fear and formalized repentance that the House of Arnaut began to draw attention, not for what it confessed, but for how. The first record is unremarkable on its face. A parish priest in the lower Languedoc noted that 3 members of the same household arrived separately over the course of a week and requested confession outside the usual hours. Each spoke calmly. Each used the same phrasing. There was no tremor in the voice, no elaboration, no attempt at concealment. They acknowledged a transgression without describing an act. They affirmed completion without expressing intent. The priest waited for detail. That did not come. When prompted, the penitent repeated the words exactly, as if repetition itself was substance. Absolution was withheld by instinct rather than rule. There was no sin to assign penance to, no category to invoke. The priest recorded the exchange and dismissed the penitent, unsettled but unconvinced of danger. The second confession altered that judgment. The phrasing was identical, not similar, identical. When the third arrived, the priest's hand shook enough to leave a visible notch in the parchment. He refused absolution again and instructed the penitent to return later. The penitent agreed without objection and did not return. Word spread through clerical channels with unusual speed. Confession is a private mechanism, but priests speak to one another when language fails. Within a month, similar reports arrived from neighboring parishes. Members of the Arnaut household presenting themselves independently, offering the same acknowledgement, leaving without resistance. No one could recall teaching the phrasing. No catechism contained it. When spoken aloud by a priest attempting replication, the words produce an immediate physiological response. Dizziness, tightness in the chest, a sense of compression that did not dissipate when the speaking stopped. The anomaly forced escalation. Confessional registers were reviewed and found wanting. Pages corresponding to the Arnaut entries darkened over time, as if ink had been applied too heavily and then bled outward. In one register, entire pages were blackened deliberately, scraped and rinked until only the margins remained legible. In those margins, a symbol appeared repeatedly, etched rather than written, shallow but precise. It did not correspond to any known shorthand. It curved inward, suggesting containment without boundary. The social reaction was anxious but controlled. The Arnauts were known quantities. Their estate employed half the village. Their public observance was impeccable. To accuse them openly would destabilize what little order remained. Instead, priests refused confession quietly. Parishioners were turned away from certain booths without explanation. Confessionals associated with the family began to empty. Those who entered reported vertigo, a sensation of standing on a slope that led nowhere. The Inquisition was notified not of heresy, but a procedural failure. This distinction matters. The correspondence intercepted between confessors does not accuse. It reports symptoms. Priests describe nausea after hearing the word spoken. One notes a lingering pressure in the ears that persisted through Massachusetts. Another describes waking to find the same phrase written repeatedly on a slate, though he did not recall writing it. These letters were collected and sealed, transferred from spiritual courts to doctrinal review with unusual haste. Investigation of the Arnaut estate followed. Inspectors arrived during daylight and found nothing overt. The chapel was oriented correctly. The books were orthodox. The household responded with courtesy and compliance. When questioned about the confessions, family members acknowledged them without distress. They did not attempt explanation. They did not repeat the words unless asked directly. And when they did, the investigators noted the same physical reactions recorded by clergy. The words were transcribed once, and then struck through by order of the scribe himself. The evidence prop that survives from this phase is a confessional register preserved against instruction. Its pages are blackened almost entirely, the parchment roughened by repeated erasure. Only the margins remain intact, and within them the symbol appears again and again, always at the same angle, always the same depth. Attempt to copy it resulted in distortion. The original resisted reproduction. The haunting residue of the Arnaut case is spatial rather than narrative. Certain confessionals were abandoned permanently. Would warped inward. Curtains stiffened as if exposed damp that was never measured. Priests refused assignment to those parishes without citing cause. Over time, the family name ceased to appear in sacramental records, replaced by blank entries that nonetheless occupied space. The Vatican directive that ended the matter did not condemn. It reassigned. Jurisdiction was transferred from spiritual courts to doctrinal review, a move reserved for questions that threatened structure rather than belief. The wording was sparse. No sin named. No penance prescribed. Only an instruction to cease listening. As the Arnaut records were sealed, a clerk added a marginal note referencing an earlier file from Italy, marked non-corrigendum. The connection was not explained. It did not need to be. The same absence had learned to speak in different rooms, and now the rooms themselves were failing. By the time the House of Calderás entered the record, the machinery meant to contain deviation was already strained. Late 15th century Spain was methodical in its persecutions, confident in its categories. Sin could be named. Error could be corrected. Even blasphemy followed patterns that experience had taught officials to recognize. What arrived from the Calderás estates did not break those patterns so much as bypass them entirely. The accusation was formal and unremarkable in tone. A rival household alleged unholy practices conducted beyond the supervision of parish authority. Witnesses were summoned. Statements were taken. What collapsed the charge was not denial, but description. Those questions spoke of gatherings that lacked invocation, lacked idol, lacked language that could be seized and held. There was no prayer, no refusal prayer, no substitution offered. The rites, such as they were, consisted of alignment and duration. People stood where instructed and remained until dismissed. Nothing was asked of them. Nothing was promised. The witnesses struggled to explain why this felt transgressive when nothing forbidden had been said. Public reaction was swift and disproportionate. Rumors spread that the Calderás were immune to sin, that absolution could not touch them because nothing could be named. Fear thrives on asymmetry, and the idea of a household beyond both crime and forgiveness proved contagious. Attendance at Calderás lands declined. Servants left quietly. Pilgrims detoured without explanation. The family responded with measured courtesy, maintaining public observance while refusing to address the substance of the accusations. The anomaly asserted itself within the investigation itself. A dossier was opened, properly stamped, indexed, and sealed. Within days, pages were found reordered without evidence of tampering. Seals were intact. The contents had shifted. Statements that should have followed one another appeared separated by unrelated material. Marginal notes migrated. When the dossier was resealed, the same displacement occurred. Scribes began marking page numbers in multiple inks, attempting to impose sequence. The sequence refused. Escalation took the form of duplication. Copies of the dossier were made and sent to separate offices. Each copy developed its own internal order, consistent within itself but irreconcilable with the others. One contained annotations not present in the original. Another lacked entire testimonies that witnesses swore they had given. Attempt to reconcile the versions produced a third document that bore characteristics of all without matching any. The dossier began to resist closure not by protest, but by multiplication. Authority responded with suppression. Orders were issued to limit access, to reduce copying, to confine the materials to a single archive. The order itself was filed and then vanished. A replacement order appeared bearing the same date and signature, but different instructions. Clerks reported difficulty recalling which version they had executed. One noted in a private hand that the file felt heavier each time it was moved, though pages were being removed rather than added. The evidence prop that survives is referred to in inventories as the master dossier, stamped illicitous yet never indexed. It occupies shelf space without catalog number. Its margins are annotated in multiple hands, some official, some not, all restrained. The annotations do not interpret. They confirm. This page reordered again. Seal reapplied. Weight increased. No explanation offered. The human cost remained diffuse. No executions followed. No public trials. Instead, the Calderás name began to slip from use. Contracts omitted it. Genealogies hesitated and then corrected themselves. Parish records retained signatures but lost context. A marriage recorded without parties. A death noted without subject. The family's estates persisted in legal limbo, owned but unassignable. The haunting residue of the case is bureaucratic rather than spectral. A file that refuses to be sealed. Paper that acquires mass without content. An investigation that cannot conclude because conclusion requires naming, and naming has already failed. When the highest authority intervened, it did so with exhaustion rather than conviction. The papal order that ended the Calderás case did not condemn practices or persons. It declared the bloodline administratively null. No doctrine cited. No appeal permitted. The order instructed that future references be treated as clerical error. The file was to remain unsealed and unindexed, a problem acknowledged without resolution. In the margin of the order, a clerk added a quiet note indicating that similar erasures had been observed elsewhere, not in documents but in calendars themselves. Days missing. Names struck without cause. Time behaving as though it had learned to avoid certain houses. The implication lingered as a dossier was returned to its shelf, still illicit, still unclosed, while elsewhere the calendar began to thin. The calendars failed without drama. In the early 17th century, Central Europe remained obsessed with order, with the measured passage of days that anchored feast, fast, and labor. Bells governed hours. Saints governed weeks. Names anchored time to flesh. When the House of Weissmann vanished from the calendar, it did so quietly enough that no one could name the moment it happened. The first sign was absence mistaken for error. Parish priests prepared for the feast of St. Ulrich, long associated with the Weissmann patronage, and found no directive to do so. The name was missing from liturgical schedules circulated from the diocese. Local copies retained it. Rome's did not. Messages were exchanged, politely at first, then with increasing precision. The replies arrived corrected but unexplained. The feast was no longer to be observed. The saint's name was not condemned. It was simply no longer required. The destabilizing event followed quickly. Births recorded within Weissmann lands lost their dates while retaining signatures and witnesses. Marriages listed participants, but not the day. Deaths were acknowledged without time of passing. These entries did not appear damaged. They appeared complete. Only the dates were absent, as if time itself had declined to attach. Social reaction was confusion without outrage. Neighboring families adjusted their expectations. Markets shifted. Bells rang when instructed and fell silent when they were not. The Weissmann estate continued to operate. Its fields worked. Its staff paid. Its gates opened and closed. Yet events there did not advance. Accounts show inventories repeated verbatim year after year, identical down to errors. Repairs were logged without cause. Harvest yields remained constant regardless of weather. The anomaly deepened when Vatican archivists compared calendars across regions. Discrepancies emerged that aligned with Weissmann holdings. Days removed in one diocese persisted in another, then vanished on revision. A calendar folio preserved from this period shows erasures so precise they left the parchment intact. Dates lifted without tearing fiber. The handwriting of the correction is flawless. The intent is unmistakable. Escalation arrived through investigation that could not stabilize its own timeline. Inspectors sent to the estate reported returning on the same day they left, though travel time contradicted the claim. Journals kept during visits contained repeated entries describing the same morning. Attempts to stay overnight failed. Bells rang for hours that no longer existed, calling no one and yet being answered by the air itself. The evidence prop at the heart of the dossier is the calendar folio, annotated with clean absences. No ink bleed, no scrape marks, just missing days. When overlaid with other records, the same dates are absent everywhere Weissmann influence touched. The pattern is consistent enough to resist dismissal. The haunting residue is auditory, bells that ring on days the church no longer recognizes. Sound announcing time that has been administratively removed. Villagers learn to ignore the ringing, to continue working through it, to behave as though nothing were wrong. The Weissmann name faded from speech. Not forbidden. Unnecessary. Rome's response was decisive and final. Doctrinal excision was authorized, not as punishment, but as correction. The House of Weissmann was removed from sacramental record, from calendar reference, from temporal acknowledgement. The erasure was complete enough that later historians would argue the family never existed. In the margin of the excision order, a final annotation appears, linking the calendar anomaly to an older Italian correspondence marked for silence rather than trial. A Belladonna reference. Precedent without citation. The realization is clear in its restraint. What had begun as misalignment, then confession without sin, then dossiers without closure, had learned to remove itself from time entirely. And somewhere, a final bloodline was already known by every prior name. By the time the House of Belladonna entered the Vatican's internal correspondence, the language of enforcement had already eroded. Late 18th century, Italy spoke in the voice of reason. Enlightenment salons debated optics and anatomy. Clergy learned to share jurisdiction with scholars who trusted instruments more than tradition. It was in this atmosphere of declared clarity that the Belladonna case surfaced, not as an accusation, but as an instruction already in force. The trigger did not arrive from the countryside or the confessional. It came from Rome itself, buried in a packet of copied letters circulated among senior archivists. The correspondence was brief and precise, directing that all inquiries concerning the Belladonna line be handled through silence rather than prosecution. The justification was a single word written in the margin: precedent. No citation followed. No date. No author. The instruction assumed recognition, as though the reader had already agreed before encountering the text. What unsettled those who read it was not the order, but the realization that it had been obeyed for decades without formal acknowledgement. Belladonna records were present everywhere and nowhere. Their name appeared in indices without page numbers. Their estates were taxed without valuation. Sacramental participation was neither granted nor denied. The anomaly was not a violation of doctrine, but a sustained exemption from it. Investigators assigned under Enlightenment protocols approached the case with confidence. They gathered documents, cross-referenced holdings, and reconstructed genealogies with mathematical patience. What they discovered was not contradiction, but recursion. Each prior dossier, Marcelli, Arnaut, Calderás, Weissmann, contained a marginal reference to Belladonna, always as origin, never as conclusion. The name functioned as a hinge. Remove it, and the earlier cases lost sequence. Retain it, and no closure was possible. Social reaction fractured along professional lines. Clergy deferred to archivists. Archivists deferred to jurists. Jurists deferred to precedent that no one could produce in full. Scholars argued jurisdiction, insisting the matter belonged to natural philosophy now that theology had withdrawn. Their instruments, when applied to Belladonna sites, behaved as instruments always had. They measured pressure, heat, sound. They recorded nothing actionable. And yet the sites resisted classification, their dimensions correct and unusable at the same time. Escalation occurred not through discovery, but through convergence. Committees formed and dissolved. Memoranda circulated and returned unchanged. At last, a coordinated action was proposed, not as punishment, but as resolution. The Belladonna line would be removed from sacramental eligibility, civil recognition, and archival presence simultaneously. No trial, no declaration. A single act, executed across systems that had learned to operate independently. The evidence prop of this final dossier is a papal brief preserved in restricted holdings. It bears no seal, no signature. Its authority derives entirely from compliance. The brief instructed erasure with surgical restraint. Index entries lifted without tearing. Marginal notes absorbed back into blank space. References corrected as clerical error. The operation was carried out with efficiency that suggests rehearsal. The haunting residue of the Belladonna case is absence formalized. An index page where 5 names should appear, left intentionally blank yet retained. Archivists report that the page cannot be removed without disrupting pagination elsewhere. It remains a negative space that anchors the volume. Bells rang as usual on the day the erasure was completed. No announcement followed. The final realization recorded in the margins of the Belladonna file is spare and unadorned. Outlawing did not end the practices. It ended the church's role as witness. What could not be named, corrected, sealed, or calendared was not destroyed. It was excluded from attention and allowed to continue elsewhere. The dossiers closed not with warning, but with administrative calm. 5 bloodlines removed, 5 patterns preserved. The silence that follows is not emptiness, but delegation. The record ends.